Hey, DMDongo here with another review from the DM's Guild. This time we're going to be looking at Infamous Adverseries, organized by Benjamin Huffman, with writing contributions by all of these folks. It's currently on sale for $14.95. If your party is looking for that heal to your hero, then I have got the supplement for you. Right, Infamous Adversaries, what is this? This is a collection of 40 takes on classic D&D monsters. Each are designed to be dropped into an ongoing campaign, or as part of a side quest, or as the focus of a single one-shot. Now, I think some of them, though, with their plot hooks and their interest, can be done as full-on campaigns, or campaign big bad evil guys. Just kind of like takes a bit more work on your part. The collection features adversaries for every tier of play, from monster ratings challenge down to 1/4, all the way up to 30. Each adversary includes a plot hook, how to kind of figure out how your party's interested and why they want to go deal with this thing, advice on role-playing the creature or villain, and what this creature is going to do when encountering the players. Each entry also includes description of the unique rewards that the characters can expect to receive on completion of either the event, or killing it, or even just maybe removing the curse that it's inflicted by. And these include things like new magical items, which you would expect, but also things like new spells and potential new allies that your party can use to help them in their longer term goals, and other prizes that your players will love. Now, all told, each entry follows a very formulaic pattern. It gives you the name, the hook, what they're where they're going next, or what they're going to be doing, or kind of where they're coming from, and then their tactics, and then finally goes into their stat blocks, or potentially if they have allies, or if there's a map involved, or a small dungeon. There's a few of those kind of things. It gives you all that stuff as well. In addition to each of the monster entries, you have an appendix which includes adversaries by the CR and by type, so you can figure out exactly what you want. If you're trying to run a one-shot very quickly, you need something to grab very fast, and you can figure out very easily. And I know CR is not the best barometer of kind of figuring out how difficult the challenge can be, but it's a pretty good thing, and I think the designers have done a very good job of kind of fine-tuning the CRs for these individual creatures. That's not to say that bad dice rolls can't happen, but you can expect that the CR rules that normally apply, so a party of 4 of that level can deal with a creature of that level. It should be relatively easy for you to figure out which monster to pick based on just the challenge rating alone. That's a really good thing to add in, and it wasn't something that was in my original release copy, but it is something that I've seen in the new version that's out on the DM's Guild, and I definitely appreciate that being in there. I want to talk about the encounter design specifically of a couple of the different monsters, because I think it's important to understand how you would implement this and why it's interesting and why it's a good encounter in general in terms of just the adversary itself and what it brings to the table. So I want to talk up first about the alchemical cube. Now, the alchemical cube at first looks like an ordinary gelatinous cube. It shares a lot of the similar properties, it shares a lot of those similar ideas, except inside of it is these little sacks that it's basically absorbed kind of interesting and unique potions. This makes the combat interesting and dynamic. That changes the way that parties manage this thing. And essentially what this means is that if this cube takes a certain amount of damage, 20 points, one of the pods inside of it ruptures and spreads the potion's magical properties with inside the creature, changing it from just a normal gelatinous cube to perhaps an invisible one, or potentially making it hasted. It means that the combat changes from being a very static, keep rushing each other down to the lowest HP, to being more dynamic and figuring out what has this potion affected now, why is this different, what has it changed, now it's harder to hit and it's faster and it's hitting me more often, what does it mean, why is it bigger, and like that kind of idea of a dynamic combat that changes based on the HP dropping of the creature is an interesting idea, and something that I think is lacking in a lot of 5e encounter design. It used to be in 4th edition you had a condition called Bloodied, which at a certain point, like I think it was half the HP, some creatures would change their tactics up and do different things. You see this a lot in video games where things get desperate. creatures do different things. Dark Souls is very famous for this, where monsters will change up their attack patterns based on how much health they have. This is something that I think 5e can learn more from, is this kind of dynamic combat which changes based on certain conditions that are happening in the area. And the Alchemical Cube kind of personifies this really well. I mean, it's segmented in terms of the amount of damage, because each time it takes 20 points of damage, it does this again. However, there is an interesting kind of side effect. If it's struck by a critical hit, your party can gain benefits from this. So maybe you can fish for that critical hit to try, if once you realize how it's working, to gain benefit from it. It means that parties can make tactical decisions, like, oh, we don't want this thing to have another potion yet. We want to wait or something. We want to figure something out. There's something weird about it, and that whole kind of thought process is kind of lacking in some areas, in some D&D groups, where they don't make tactical decisions. It's just a race to the HP bottom. And the Alchemical Cube means that you can't just race to the HP bottom, because this thing can get more dangerous the lower its HP get, because there's multiple potions running through it, essentially. And I really like that idea, and that's why the Alchemical Cube is kind of one of my favorite ones. Other one I want to talk about is Abigarada. I hope I pronounced that correctly, but I've got no pronunciation guide, so I'm not entirely sure. I know I'm sticking to the A's here, but this is something that I really want to talk about, because I think it's a really interesting encounter design, but I think it has some flaws that I want to speak about as well. The Abigarada, is essentially a quattle of multiple colors. And essentially, as your party fights it, every 3 rounds, it shifts color from violet all the way to white. So it's a rainbow coatl. I think I'm pronouncing that right as well. I'm not entirely sure. But that kind of, the way that works is that it manifests in different ways. Things like, for instance, if it's blue, it can cast certain spells, and attacks made against it with heated weapons temporarily bypass its non-magical damage immunity. Now, that's something that's really difficult to work out during combat, especially if it's changing every 3 rounds. Now, this thing only has 175 HP, and it's a challenge rating 9. It does fly, so that gives it some resistance to a lot of the really high bursty damage characters and player types, like paladins and fighters, unless they're using bows. But it does mean that eventually this thing's going to get whittled down, and probably you're looking at maybe 2, maybe 3 kind of changes, cycles as it goes through. For your party to actually work out all of these different things, or even the 3 that they come across, it's very trial and error to kind of work out what's going on. So the information gathering aspect of this fight is very complex, and that's how I kind of build all my encounters. We all have 3 basic steps. You gather information, you plan, and then you execute the plan. And this is from a player's perspective. So this is how this kind of should work for every single encounter, broadly speaking. This one has a problem that gathering the information that how this stuff works is very difficult in combat, even with, say, a party of 5 level 9 adventurers or so. You're trying to work out, well, if it's currently blue, that means we need to use heated weapons. It's using all water spells. Maybe we need to use fire on it. But that doesn't necessarily translate to things like I'm trying to figure out how to use heated weapons or projectiles into it. It makes it very difficult to think, and there's even more complex one like orange, which requires it with colorful weapons or projectiles. Currently bypass it. And that's a lot of extra work for a DM as well, because you're trying to track what kind of weapons each party is using in terms of what they actually have available to them that can cause or bypass this damage if they're and these are, by the way, this is only for non-magical attacks. So for instance, if they have any magical weapons, this bypasses it completely anyway. So this is really only going to apply to anyone who doesn't have a +1 weapon at level 9, and that's quite rare for it to occur. Now it is likely that you'll have like maybe level 7 adventurers in this case, and I know that magical weapons in general are kind of like they're not a needed thing. But it would be interesting to see how you could, as a DM, I think this one requires a lot of extra work, how you could manifest some of this information gathering up front to your players, to give them hints and clues to figure out how they would come across this and how they would come across the kind of information that would allow them to figure out how this particular monster and creature worked and what the various colors meant, or maybe even just some of them, so that your party could better prepare and have an interesting and dynamic encounter as they switch weapons throughout the fight, trying to beat this thing down. It would make the combat more interesting, but it does mean that you're doing a lot more work as a DM, but I think it's worth it if you can figure that out. Now, unfortunately, the supplement doesn't give you any help in that regard, so that's a shame, but I'm not going to knock any points off of it because I think that's part of the fun as a DM is to figure that stuff out, but it gives you a really good starting point. I will also say that every single encounter, or an adversary, I guess is the right word here, in this book is kind of built around this idea, this premise that there is something unique and interesting about this creature. It's not just a koala. It's not just a gelatinous cube. It's not just a boulette. It's not just a mind flayer. They are weird. They are the exceptional, the strange, the unusual variations of their type that make them special and make them worthy of being the heel to your party's heroes. And that's the whole point of this supplement. On to stuff I liked about this. I liked a lot of it. I love that the art, the one for the non-printer friendly version, is really beautiful, really evocative, really cool. I especially like things like the Leech King. I really liked that art when I saw it first. And I really love the cover on it. It gives that really cool idea of an adventure coming up against a great and terrible adversary, a terrible foe that they have to defeat that is unusual in some way. I really like that they added in the appendix to give you adversaries by CR and type. That was something that I was going to mention that wasn't in my printer-friendly version, but is in the new one. I really, really appreciate that because it makes it so much easier to find these things than via alphabetical order. I love the fact that each adversary includes hooks, potential layers, if they're powerful enough, regional effects, the tactics, so like how they fight. Because too often that we give you a monster and we go, here you go, here's a monster. We have no idea how to play it, but here's 20 goblins. How do they fight? We'll just throw them at the party and they'll eventually say, well, no, look at their stat block. Look at what they can do. And they've got this, and you have to tease that out to figure out how to fight with them properly. And it takes a lot more mental gymnastics to get to that point. At least here you're kind of getting an understanding of the kind of tactics these creatures use. Flying creatures pick things up and drop them from great heights because it's really devastating and very difficult to deal with for a lot of players. Those are the kinds of things I love to see, where it's like, well, if they're in this situation, they'll use this. If they're in these situations, they'll do this. Telling you outright, these are the kind of tactics they use, and that's a really good thing. I also particularly like the rewards. It's not just magic items, and that's kind of like a big given. But the magic items are really interesting. Some of them are very unique and like different. They are very specific to the monsters and creatures that are presented in the book. And I also really like the fact that you get a lot of the monsters come with spells, because that's something that I think a lot of spellcasters just feel left out on. All these magical items floating around, all this stuff, and it's like, well, yeah, everyone can use all that stuff, but I'm kind of like, well, I'll take my Rod of the Pack Keeper or my Wand of the War Mage, and I guess that's it, guys. Oh yeah, maybe I'll get that Archmage cloak. These things are more, but then you go, well, here's a spell you can have, and that instantly opens up the idea that there are spells in the world that don't necessarily exist that exist outside of the player's handbook, and they can learn them. It gives a good way of allowing access to those things, and I really like that as a reward scheme. I've always been very a big proponent of that as a reward for caster classes, that new spells, different spells, interesting spells are a great way of rewarding those kinds of players. Now, what didn't I like about this? So there's only one thing I'm really going to mention here. It's something I kind of alluded to earlier, is that that I would have loved to see a pronunciation guide for some of the more difficult to enunciate creatures. I think a lot of the names are really nice, really like thematic and really well done. They fit the various creatures' themes and ideas. For instance, I don't need a name. I don't need a pronunciation guide for cheddar, but I might need one for Osrock, the faux phoenix, or potentially Ankh Tepot. I think I'm getting that wrong. And in fact, I'm 90% sure I'm getting that wrong. And I would have loved to have pronunciation guides of the various creatures, especially from cultures that I don't necessarily have a great understanding of. I can do Spanish and German and English pretty well. When you're talking about Egyptian-ish things, or potentially even further afield than that, I get a little dodgy in my pronunciations. So I'd really appreciated a pronunciation guide there. And that's kind of it. I think this is for what it is, it's a really great guide and a really well done and put together set of adversaries for a D&D 5th edition game. Now, on to my final thoughts and my rating. Overall, I really like this. I really like the idea behind it. I really like the idea of creating a bunch of unique and interesting enemies for your players to fight. Like I said before, the heal to their heroes, and using them in a way that is either a side quest or potentially a big bad evil guy, because some of these are quite powerful and they have very interesting backstories that you can tie into a long-running campaign. It is a wealth of information, useful and good and interesting tactics, and good and interesting game design and encounter design. Some of the monsters in here have very interesting ideas on how they react to things and how they do things, how you can best utilize things like spider climb, for instance, on the Drider enemy Athelin Adamar, using that in a way that means that they can get into places where they can cause the most amount of damage possible that it's hard for parties to deal with. Things like the alchemical cube, which I mentioned before, which change based on the length of combat being going on and get harder as you fight, as you get lower and lower HP by the nature of the amount of potions flowing through it. There's a lot of really interesting stuff in here that I think, even if you weren't going to take the plot hooks out, just taking the creature itself is a really good way of kind of figuring out how to run some more complex and more interesting encounters and more interesting and unique encounter design. It's a really great there's a lot of good things here. And for that reason, I'm going to give it a perfect score, a 5 out of 5. While I would have loved to see a pronunciation guide, I think that's just an icing on the cake. This is a perfect collection of really great creatures for your Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition game that you can drop in incredibly easy. And with the addition of that appendix at the end to check what CR they are, you could probably run one of these guys very quickly, probably within like maybe an hour and a half of prep. You could be ready to go and running with one of these. It'd be a really, really great little short one shot. So thank you. This has been DM Dongo. Please do remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And please do remember to use my affiliate code, which is down below, if you decide to purchase Infamous Adversaries organized by Benjamin Huffman. Thank you. Peace out.